The sound woke her from the inside, not the outside. That was how she would describe it later. As if the sound had found a way in, before it was even heard, settling somewhere below her ribs before her ears had processed it. She was on her feet, with one hand against the wall, and her eyes adjusting to the low firelight, before she was even fully separate from sleep. The fire had burned down to a quiet amber glow. She had let it do that on purpose tonight, because the heat made Lyra restless, and a restless Lyra was a crying Lyra, and a crying Lyra was the kind of sound that reached farther than these walls. Right now, she preferred that nothing about this lodge reached farther than these walls. The infant was quiet. She was in her cot near the eastern wall, her small fist tucked under her chin, her chest moving in that deep, certain rhythm that meant she had fully given herself to sleep, and intended to stay there. Roan was on the wide mat in the far corner, face down as always, one arm stretched across his twin's back. Silas slept on his side with his face pointed toward the door. Silas always did that, faced the door in his sleep. Seraphine had noticed it on the second night the children were here, and had been thinking about it, at intervals, for 4 months since. It was not something a 5-year-old should do without knowing he was doing it. It was not something a 5-year-old should have learned to do at all. But Silas had learned it, and the learning told her something she had filed quietly in the back of her mind and returned to often. She moved to the front window without sound. She had gotten very good at moving without sound over 6 years in this pack. An Omega who moved quietly, stayed out of conversations she did not want to be part of. An Omega who moved quietly, could notice things that louder people missed. These were not advantages she had sought. They were tools she had developed out of necessity, and discovered were useful for purposes beyond their original intent. The shutter was not fully closed. She kept a gap there deliberately, just wide enough to see through, without creating a visible opening from the outside. The clearing beyond was pale and still, under a high moon. The open ground between the lodge and the tree line, empty and unbroken. The settlement fires were far to the left, burning low but present. Nothing moved between her and them. She stayed at the window, and listened to the forest do its ordinary things. The crack of wood contracting in the cold air, the calls of night birds in the middle distance, the soft movement of underbrush, somewhere off to the right, where something small was going about its private business. She knew these sounds. She knew the shape they made together, the specific texture of a normal night in this forest. This night had that texture, but it had something else beneath it, a quality that was almost a sound, but was not quite. More like the space between sounds, managed and held deliberately. Something out there was being very careful to be quiet. She stayed at the window for a long time. The sound did not repeat. Eventually, she sat down on the floor with her back against the wall beneath the window, in a position from which she could see the front door, the twins on their mat, and the edge of Lyra's cot without turning her head. She rested her hands flat on her knees and kept her breathing steady. She did not go back to sleep. She was a light sleeper by habit, and a light sleeper by necessity, and she had learned over time that the two kinds had slightly different qualities. The habitual kind could be worked back into depth with practice. The necessary kind stayed shallow no matter how tired you were, because some part of you had made a decision that being unreachable was too dangerous, and was going to enforce that decision regardless of your feelings about it. She had been the necessary kind of light sleeper since the third night the children arrived. Seraphine Vale had come to the Ashwood pack at the age of 17. She had arrived the way Omegas arrived at unfamiliar packs. Alone, quiet, with her eyes down and her expectations low. Her birth pack had broken apart the previous winter, after a leadership challenge that had been building for 2 years, and finally erupted over 3 days in December. And when it was over, 3 wolves were dead, and everyone else had scattered in directions she did not always know. Her parents had been gone for 2 years before the dispute. There was no one to go back to, so she had walked forward instead, 3 days through cold country, following a rumor that the Ashwood pack was stable and not hostile to low-ranked wolves passing through. Both things proved true. The elder on gate duty, a man named Gareth with gray at his temples and the measured manner of someone who had made peace with the limits of what he could offer, had looked her over for about 4 seconds and told her she could stay. He had not asked her name. She had given it anyway, because her name was the one thing she still owned completely. Seraphine Vale, said clearly, without apology, because whatever the world thought of her rank, it did not get to take her name as well. The Ashwood pack was not a cruel place. She had known crueler. The wolves here were practical people who understood that every member of a functioning pack served a purpose, even the lowest-ranked ones, especially the lowest-ranked ones, in some ways, because the work that no one else wanted to do still needed doing. Seraphine did that work. She cooked when the usual cook was unavailable. She mended the children's winter clothes when the seamstress had too many orders. She repaired broken fence posts at the eastern boundary and restacked the wood supply after storms scattered it, and cleaned the storage rooms when the smell got too strong for anyone with a more sensitive nose. She did all of it steadily and without complaint, and asked for very little, because asking for very little meant she could not be easily disappointed. Over 6 years, she had settled into the Ashwood pack, the way a stone settles into a riverbed. Not loved by the water, not celebrated, but held in place by it. She had accepted this. It had seemed, for a long time, like the closest thing to belonging she was going to find. And then the Alpha King had sent his children, and every quiet understanding she had about her own life had shifted without warning. The message had come first, 8 days before the children arrived. A rider bearing the Alpha King's seal had arrived at the Ashwood border, and the pack elders had gathered in the main hall, and read the letter 3 times before they were satisfied they understood its weight. Kalen Drath, Alpha King of the Northern Wolf Territories, and the most powerful ruler in these lands, was moving his forces east. A border faction had been pressing his eastern lines for 2 years, and patience had run out. The campaign was necessary, and would not be brief. His 3 children, twin boys of 5 and an infant daughter of 4 months, could not accompany him into a war zone. He was requesting that the Ashwood pack shelter them until the campaign concluded. It was worded as a request. Everyone understood it was not one. The pack agreed. The children arrived 6 days later, brought by 2 household attendants, who handed them over with the visible relief of people completing a task that had been too large for them and were glad to see the back of it. The twins stepped down from the cart and stood close together in the clearing, Roan slightly in front and Silas slightly behind, and looked around with careful eyes that took in the settlement and the people and the lodge, and said nothing at all about any of it. Lyra was still sleeping in her cloth sling, carried by the second attendant, and she continued sleeping through the entire transfer, with a composure that suggested she was not yet aware of the magnitude of what was happening to her. The pack women gathered at the edges of the clearing. They looked at the 3 children. They found other things to attend to. Seraphine had been crossing the yard with a laundry basket when it happened. She had stopped because something was happening, and she wanted to see what it was. She had been standing there when Roan turned his head, scanning the gathered faces with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to be subtle about what he is looking for, and his eyes found hers and stopped. She set down the basket. She walked across the clearing. She crouched in front of him, because he was 5 years old, and it seemed important not to stand over him. "Are you hungry?" she said. He stared at her for a very long time, then, a little. "Good," she said. "I made soup this morning. It's still warm. Are you and your brother coming inside, or should I bring it out here?" He considered this with the seriousness of someone making a genuine decision. "We'll come," he said. She picked up the laundry basket, led them inside, set the basket near the door, and never gotten back to it that day. That had been 4 months ago, and she had not spent a single night away from them since. Dawn came in slowly, the gray before the light, then the thin gold when the sun cleared the ridge to the east. Roan was the first to wake. He always was. He lifted his head and looked at her on the floor without surprise, because she had been in positions like this before, and he had learned not to make it into something that required comment. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept some," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I heard something too late, when the fire was very low. I lay still." She kept her voice level. "What did you hear?" "A scrape. Against the outside wall. Like a sleeve on wood." He pushed his hair out of his face. "I thought about getting up, but you always say if there is real danger you will wake us, so I waited." "You did exactly right," she said. He processed this. "Is someone watching the lodge?" She looked at him. He was 5 years old, and he was asking this question the way a person twice his age would ask it. Directly, without drama, simply wanting the accurate answer so he could arrange himself accordingly. "I'm going to find out today," she said. "Until I do, you and Silas stay inside." "All right," he said, no hesitation. Silas woke a few minutes later, sitting up and looking at the door before he looked at anything else, which was his habit. He looked at Seraphine. He said nothing. He found his shoes. She made breakfast and watched the three of them eat, and when they were settled and Lyra had been fed and was drowsy in her cot again, she told the twins she was checking the wood supply and stepped outside. She went around the north side of the lodge the way she always went when she checked the wood, but she went slowly, and she looked at the ground. The earth along the north wall had been softened by rain 3 days ago and had dried just enough to preserve an impression. 4 prints in the mud, deep in the center, shallower at the edges, not walking prints, standing prints. The prints of someone who had stood at this wall and waited, shifting weight very slowly from heel to toe, and back, in the patient manner of someone who was not in a hurry and had no intention of being noticed. She picked up 2 logs from the woodpile. She looked at the tree line. The forest held its breath and looked back. She carried the logs inside and set them near the fire and said nothing. She found Cole near the eastern fence an hour later, working on a blade with the steady focus of a man who communicates partly through always seeming occupied. He did not look up when she stopped near him. 3 days ago, he said, without preamble, Nora's son came back from the eastern pass. Came back fast and pale and went straight to Gareth. I wasn't meant to hear the conversation. The main hall has thin walls. He paused. The stone ran along the blade in a slow, even rhythm. Something is moving through the eastern corridor, organized, with people and a purpose, moving in this direction. She waited. Could be days, Cole said. Could be fewer than days. She thanked him and walked back to the lodge. On the way she stopped at the main hall and found Gareth and told him about the prints along the north wall. He listened with the particular patience of a man who has already made a decision about how seriously to take something and is allowing you to finish speaking as a courtesy. We're monitoring the situation, he said. She looked at him. The children need a more secure position, she said, or someone assigned specifically to defend the lodge. Seraphine, her name, waited. Security decisions are made by those with the standing to make them. She said nothing else. She walked back to the lodge. On the way she passed Petra, who ran the pack's herb stores, and had always been decent to Seraphine in the uncomplicated way of someone who didn't spend much time thinking about rank. Petra took one look at her face and stopped walking. What did Gareth say? She said. That it's being monitored, Seraphine said. Petra made a short sound, then she lowered her voice. My husband came back from the boundary this morning. He said there is a group 2 days east of here. Not pack wolves, organized men with weapons and a banner. She paused. An iron veil, over an eye. He said nobody in the Northern Territories flies that banner, unless they do a very specific kind of work. Seraphine filed it. An iron veil over an eye. She walked back to the lodge and stood in the doorway, and looked at the twins arguing over the stone collection, and Lyra on her back between them, batting at the air above her, with slow, satisfied movements. 3 children, not hers by any blood or law or formal arrangement. She had no claim on them that the world would recognize, and no authority over them that anyone would respect. She was also, she understood now, the only person in this pack who was going to do anything about what was coming. She stepped inside. She moved the short carving knife to the windowsill where she could reach it from anywhere in the main room. She sat down near the fire where she could see everything at once, and she began, quietly and thoroughly, to think about what the next few days were going to require of her. She spent the following morning preparing the back room. She did not explain to the twins what she was doing, not precisely. She told them they were making the storage room at the rear of the lodge more comfortable, and this was true in the same way that a great many true things were also incomplete. The storage room was the last room at the end of the hall, small, stone-walled, with a heavy door, and no windows, except for a thin ventilation gap, near the ceiling, too narrow for a grown person to pass through. It smelled of dried herbs and old wood, and the particular cold that stone walls held in winter. It was not a comfortable space, but it had qualities that now outweighed comfort in every calculation she was making. She brought the spare sleeping mats from the main room. She brought the warmest blankets. She brought the supply of preserved food she had been quietly building over the past week. Dried fruit, hard bread, herbs that would make adequate tea and water stored in sealed clay jars she had already positioned in the corner. She brought the oil lamp and extra wicks, and enough oil to burn for 2 full days without a refill. She set up Lyra's cot in the warmest corner, against the rear wall where no cold came through. Roan carried things with the enthusiastic efficiency of a 5-year-old who was being asked to help with something that feels real, which meant he carried more than he needed to on each trip and moved fast. Silas was precise and careful and set each thing down in the right position without being told, which was how Silas did most things. "It's actually not terrible in here," Roan said at one point, looking around the back room with a critical expression that suggested he was revising an earlier opinion downward to a less bad one. "The lamp will help," Seraphine said. "It's cold," Silas said. "The blankets will fix that," she said. While the twins were occupied arranging blankets and debating the placement of the oil lamp, she made a small adjustment to the back room door. The iron latch bar that had been mounted on the outside, designed to lock things in, she moved to the inside. A 30-second task with a screwdriver and 2 replacement bolts she had taken from the repair kit in the main hall 2 days ago. She did it while Roan was explaining the organizational logic of the back room's new layout to Lyra, who was lying on a blanket receiving this information with the patient, unfocused attention of a baby being talked at. She moved the latch and said nothing about it. By mid-morning, the room was as prepared as she could make it. She stood in the doorway and looked at the result: the mats, the blankets, the lamp in its corner, the food and water, the cot, the heavy door with its latch now on the inside, and felt the particular satisfaction that came, not from something being good, but from something being finished, which was its own category of relief, when you had been carrying a task in your mind, and it was finally complete. "Can we have lunch in here?" Roan asked. "We can have lunch wherever you want," she said. They ate lunch in the back room, all 4 of them crowded on the mats. Roan found this adventurous. Silas found it genuinely preferable to the main room, which told her something about him. Lyra was propped against Seraphine's knee and worked at a piece of bread with the focused intensity of a person who has recently discovered that solid food exists and is not yet over the wonder of it. After lunch, when Lyra was asleep and Roan was reorganizing the stone collection he had insisted on moving to the back room shelf, Silas came and sat beside Seraphine near the main room door. He sat quietly for a moment, which was typical for him. Silas approached most things at his own pace, letting the space around him fill with what he needed to understand before he said anything. He had been doing this since the first day she knew him. She had learned to wait for it. Then he said, "2 nights ago I heard the packmen outside." She kept her hands still in her lap. "Which ones?" "Owen and the tall one with the dark beard. I don't know his name." He looked at his hands. "I was awake because Lyra was crying. They were near the back wall. They didn't know I could hear." She waited. "They said the children are not their wolves to die for," Silas said. He was very precise about the words, the way he was precise about everything he considered important. One of them said the Alpha King made a mistake sending them here. The other one said they should move on, before it becomes a problem for the pack. The words stayed in the air between them. "What does move on mean?" Silas said. He asked it without any expression to guide the answer, which was more unsettling than if he had asked it with fear. She looked at him. She thought about what he deserved, which was the truth, and what she could give him, which was a version of the truth, sized for a 5-year-old who needed to stay calm rather than terrified. "Some people say things when they are worried that come out worse than they mean," she said. "They said it twice," Silas said. "The same words, both of them. It didn't sound like worrying. It sounded like deciding." She studied his face. He was watching her with those old, quiet eyes, not anxious, not panicked, just waiting for her to give him something true he could use. "Seraphine," he said, "are they going to make us leave?" "No," she said. The word came out simply, and without any space in it for qualification, because she discovered in the moment of saying it that it was completely and specifically true. Nobody was making these children leave. They were going to stay exactly where they were, and she was going to stay with them, and whatever was moving through the eastern corridor was going to reach her before it reached them. Silas nodded once. He got up and went back to Roan and the stones. She sat for a while after that, with the sounds of the lodge settling around her, the twins' low debate, Lyra's soft sleep breathing, the small noises of the afternoon wind against the walls, and she thought about Owen and the tall man saying the children were not their wolves to die for. She thought about Gareth and his monitoring. She thought about the Ashwood pack, which had given her 6 years of roof and food and a kind of existence, and which was going to step to the side when the time came. She did not judge them for it. Self-preservation was a reasonable thing. It was not a character flaw. She was simply not going to follow their lead. She made 2 trips outside in the afternoon, ostensibly for wood, and to return a borrowed bowl to the cook's stores. On each trip she took different paths, and watched what the pack was doing with the careful, lateral attention she had developed over years of being someone who observed from the margins. What she saw was organized withdrawal, not panic, something more deliberate. The senior wolves were gathering near the main hall in the particular formation that preceded decisions. The hunters were in a smaller group near the eastern fence, talking in the low, direct manner of people sharing operational information. 3 young men she recognized as the pack's fastest runners were loitering near the western tree line without apparent purpose, which in her experience meant they had a purpose they had been told to disguise. The Ashwood pack was not preparing to fight. The Ashwood pack was preparing to move. She went back to the lodge, and she did not leave again that evening. Cole found her at the well the following morning before the settlement was fully awake. He came around the far side of the well structure with the particular manner of a man arriving at a place where he intended to have a private conversation without announcing that he intended to have a private conversation. "You've seen it," he said. It was not a question. "The withdrawal preparation," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The early light was gray and cold. "Gareth called a full meeting of the senior wolves last night. I was not invited. I heard enough." He paused. "The working decision is to hold position until the Iron Veil reaches the boundary, and then negotiate safe passage for the pack, in exchange for not interfering with the contract." Seraphine was still. "The Iron Veil," she said. "That's the name," Cole said. "They take bloodline contracts. Someone with money and a reason has contracted them to end the Alpha King's line while he is occupied with the Eastern Campaign." He looked at her directly. "They're not coming for the pack. The pack is simply in the way, and Gareth has decided being in the way is not a position he intends to hold." She looked at the water in the bucket she was filling. "How many of them?" she said. "Best count we have is 40 to 45, Cole said. "Crossbows and blades. Professionals. 45 professionals with crossbows, and she had a carving knife she had been sharpening by hand for a week." "There's more," Cole said. "Holt runs their operation in this territory. He's been doing this kind of work for 14 years. He is not a man who fails at contracts." "What's the timeline?" she said. 2 days at their current pace, maybe less." He paused. "They're moving slowly on purpose. They want to arrive and finish without resistance, not rush in and create complications." She nodded. She lifted the full water bucket. "What are you going to do?" he said. She looked at him. Cole was one of the few people in this pack who asked her questions as though her answers were the ones that mattered. "I'm going to stay in the lodge," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The pack won't stand with you." "I know," she said. Another moment of quiet. "Is there anything you need?" he said. She thought about it honestly. She thought about what she had and what she did not have, and about the one thing she had not yet done that might change the arithmetic of what was coming. "I need to reach the Alpha King," she said. "Someone fast, who can get a message into the Eastern Campaign territory." Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I know a courier, 3 hours north. He's fast, and he doesn't lose messages." "Can you reach him tonight?" she said. "Before midnight," he said. She felt something release slightly in her chest. Not relief, because she was nowhere near a position for relief, but a small reduction in the weight of the impossible thing she was carrying. She had done what she could from the outside. A message was going. Whether it arrived in time, whether it made a difference, whether the Alpha King was even in a position to respond, none of that was in her hands. She was going to let it not be in her hands, and she was going to focus on what was. "Thank you," she said. Cole said, "Don't thank me yet." She picked up the water bucket and walked back to the lodge. Inside, the twins were already awake, and in the back room, having apparently decided that the back room was now the preferred space for the stone collection debate. She could hear Roan's voice going at his usual clip about something she couldn't quite make out, and Silas's quieter responses arriving at measured intervals. She set down the bucket. She stood in the main room for a moment, looking toward the back room door, listening to the particular sound of 2 children being ordinary with each other, in the way that children were ordinary when they felt safe. That sound, The casual, absorbed, completely present sound of it was the thing she was going to stand in that doorway for. She had no doubt about that now. She had passed the point where it was a question. She went into the back room and sat down on the mat beside Lyra's cot and watched Roan demonstrate the relative merits of two nearly identical stones with a thoroughness that would have been impressive in a law court, and she let the ordinary sounds of the afternoon fill her up, because she understood that these sounds were a resource too, and that she was going to need them. Later, when the twins had worn themselves down to the half-doze that children fell into after long active mornings, and Lyra was sleeping between them in the cot, Seraphine sat in the main room and ran through everything she had and everything she needed. She had the carving knife. She had Cole's promise of a better blade, left at the base of the north wall before dawn. She had the back room, with its stone walls, and its heavy door, and its latch now on the inside. She had food and water for the children for 2 days. She had the specific knowledge of this lodge that came from 4 months of living in it. The exact dimensions of the front doorway, the angle of the morning light on the clearing, the creak of the front step in cold weather, the sound of the back room door when it was fully latched. She had herself. She thought about that honestly. She was not large, not fast, not trained in any formal way. She was an Omega, with no rank, and no backing, and no alliance she could call on. She was also the only person who was going to stand in that doorway. She had run the numbers from every angle she could think of, and that was how they came out every time. But she also had a knowledge of these 3 children so thorough that it had become something different from knowledge. It had become knowing, the deeper kind, the kind that lived in the hands and the body and the habit, that did not require thought. She knew how to keep Roan calm when he was frightened. She knew the sound of Silas counting under his breath when the world was too loud. She knew the exact weight of Lyra sleeping on her shoulder, and the specific circle walk that settled the baby when nothing else would. She had something else too. Something she had spent 2 days trying to find the right name for, and had finally decided did not need a name. It was the specific quality of a decision that had been made so completely that there was no longer any part of her pulling against it. The decision was made. The question of whether she could do it was not a question anymore. The only question was what the doing of it would cost. She was willing to pay whatever it cost. She sat in the main room and let the afternoon move around her, and she stayed exactly where she was. She walked into the main hall uninvited on the second afternoon. She had never been inside it. Omegas did not go into the main hall. It was not a written rule. It was one of the unwritten ones, the kind enforced by the accumulated weight of nobody ever doing it, which in any ranked society amounted to the same thing as a prohibition. But she had reached the end of the list of things she could do from outside the room where decisions were being made, and there was still one thing left, which was to walk through the door. She pushed it open and walked in. There were 11 wolves in the hall. Way, Gareth at the head of the table. 6 senior members arranged along the benches, 4 others standing near the walls, including Cole, who was at the far end, and whose expression did not change when she came in, which told her he had been halfway expecting it. Gareth looked at her with the particular expression of a man encountering something that does not fit his established map of the world. Seraphine, he said. Her name waited. I know the name of the group coming through the eastern corridor, she said. She did not look around for permission to speak. She simply spoke. The Iron Veil Syndicate. They take bloodline contracts. They are coming here to end the Alpha King's children. The silence in the hall was informative. The specific quality of it, not the silence of people hearing new information, but the silence of people hearing confirmed what they already knew, told her more than anything Gareth might have said. We are aware of the situation, Gareth said. Then you're aware they number 43 men, she said, armed professionals, and that Holt, their commander, has been doing this work for 14 years. Nobody spoke. She looked around the room. 11 wolves, who had been having a meeting without her, making decisions about 3 children who were in her care. She felt something that was not quite anger. It was too cold to be anger. It was the specific clarity that came when you understood exactly what was happening, and exactly what you were going to do about it. I would like to know the options under discussion, she said. The room was quiet. Then Dara, the most direct person in any room she occupied, a senior pack woman who had always reminded Seraphine of a blade that had been sharpened so many times it had gotten smaller but only more precise, said, One option is to negotiate with the Iron Veil. Offer them non-interference from the pack in exchange for the pack's safety. You mean hand over the children, Seraphine said. Dara did not flinch. That is what non-interference would mean, practically. That option is not one I will accommodate, Seraphine said. The room was very quiet now. You will accommodate, Gareth said slowly. Whatever is decided here. She looked at him. I know what my rank is, she said. I know what my standing is in this pack. I know that I am not in this room in any official capacity, and I know that no decision made here requires my agreement. She paused. I also know those 3 children. I know which side Roan sleeps on and which words Lyra responds to, and that Silas counts things when he is trying to stay calm. I know them in the way that comes from 4 months of daily life, and not from any official role. She looked at the table. Whoever hands them to the Ironvale Syndicate will do it over me. That is not a challenge to anyone in this room. It is simply a fact about what I am going to do. The silence this time was longer and had a different quality. Less dismissal, more the quality of a room recalibrating, people adjusting the picture they had been carrying. Cole, at the far end, said nothing. But he was looking at her, with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Gareth was very still. He had run this pack's daily affairs for 11 years, and he had long ago learned to be the steadiest person in any difficult room. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, carefully, You are 1 Omega, unarmed, for all practical purposes, against 43 professionals. Yes, she said. You cannot stop them. I am not going to stop them, she said. I am going to be in the doorway when they arrive. Whether this pack stands behind me is your decision, not mine. I am not asking any of you to die for them. I am telling you that I am going to stand there regardless, and I am asking you, while you make your decision, to consider what it means that the only person in this pack prepared to stand in that doorway is the one who cooks the soup. She left the hall. She closed the door behind her without any force. She walked back across the clearing in the ordinary way she always walked. Not too fast, not too slow. Nothing about her posture said anything at all. Inside the lodge, Roan was lying on his back on the sleeping mat, with his eyes on the ceiling, which was his thinking position. Silas was at the table sorting stones by a criterion that Seraphine had not been able to decode in 4 months of observation. Lyra was in her cot, awake, staring at the space above her, with the focused intentness of a baby who had found something interesting that no one else could see. Seraphine sat down near the cot. Lyra turned her head and looked at her, and then reached out and closed her small fingers around Seraphine's index finger with the casual, total grip that babies had. She sat there for a while, holding the baby's hand, while her mind ran through what came next. She had done what she could inside the pack structure. She had gone to Gareth more than once. She had spoken in the main hall. Cole was sending the message north. 3 things done, all of them necessary, none of them sufficient on their own. What remained was the 4th thing, which was also the final thing, which was the only thing that was entirely hers to do. She found Cole at the fence before the evening meal. He was in his usual position, working in the focused manner of a man who communicated partly through always seeming occupied. She stopped near him. Did you reach the courier? She said. Before dawn, Cole said. He left before first light. He knows the fastest route east. Good, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The hall meeting ended about an hour after you left, he said. No final decision announced. Gareth sent 2 people to the eastern boundary to do what he called a visual assessment. Which means they are watching the Ironvale's approach and calculating timing, she said. Yes. Cole paused. He is going to let them come to the edge and then attempt to negotiate. I know, she said. He will not succeed, Cole said. The Iron Veil doesn't renegotiate active contracts. I know that too, she said. He looked at the blade in his hands. How much time do you think we have? She calculated. 2 days east, moving slowly, to be certain, rather than fast. Holt was a professional who wanted a clean outcome. Clean outcomes required confirming the target location, confirming the absence of organized resistance, and then moving in with enough force to make the conclusion certain. They know the pack won't stand in their way, she said. They probably knew that before they arrived in the territory. Someone told them, or they found out. Either way, they will not rush. They will come when they are ready. She paused. Tomorrow night, or the morning after, most likely. "And you will be in the doorway," Cole said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a long time. The evening sounds of the settlement moved around them, the ordinary sounds of a pack going about the end of a day, people heading toward the cook fires, children being called in, the smell of food beginning to travel on the air. "I have a blade I've been meaning to give you," Cole said, very quietly. "Not the carving knife. A proper one. Short enough to use in a close space." She looked at him. "Cole. Tomorrow morning," he said, "before anyone else is up. I'll leave it at the base of the north wall." She looked at him for a long moment. There was nothing she could say that was the right size for what he was doing, so she said the smaller true thing instead. "Thank you," she said. He made the sound that was not quite a laugh. "Don't thank me yet," he said, for the second time. She went back to the lodge and made the evening meal, and she sat with the children through the long, warm, ordinary hours of the evening, and she let herself feel every moment of it, because she understood that she was spending something valuable, and she wanted to be paying full attention while she did. Roan asked her, near the end of the evening, whether she was worried about something. "What makes you ask?" she said. "You keep looking at us," he said, "even when we're not doing anything interesting." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that unusual?" He thought about it with his characteristic honesty. "You usually look at us when we're doing something that needs watching. Tonight you're looking at us even when we're just sitting." He paused. "It's like you're counting." "I'm not counting," she said. "I know exactly how many of you there are." He accepted this, though she could tell he was not entirely satisfied by it. Roan had a very accurate censor for incomplete answers. He tolerated them, when he had decided to tolerate them, not because he missed them. She put them to sleep with the ordinary rituals, the washing, the blankets, the brief negotiation from Roan about whether sleeping was strictly necessary tonight, the longer quiet process of Silas arranging himself and the room in his mind before he could release himself to sleep. She sat with them until Roan's voice trailed off mid-sentence, and Silas's breathing slowed to the deep, even rhythm that meant he was fully under. She fed Lyra in the dark, and walked the small circles, and sang the wordless song, and she felt the baby go heavy and loose against her shoulder, in the way that was one of the most complete feelings she had ever known, the feeling of something trusting you so entirely that it did not hold anything back. She laid Lyra in the cot. She sat on the floor of the main room with her back against the wall, and she looked at the 3 sleeping children, and she felt the full weight of the next morning settle on her. She did not resist it. She let it settle. She breathed around it. She let it become part of the ground she was standing on. Then she took out the small whetstone she kept near the fire, and she sharpened the carving knife until it was the best it was going to be, working the stone along the blade in the slow, quiet rhythm Cole used when he worked on his own blades. And she thought about the Ironvale Syndicate, and the doorway, and the specific feeling of her feet on the floor. She thought about what it meant to stay, not to fight, not to win, not to succeed in any conventional sense, just to stay, to be in the doorway and to not move, to let whatever came at her come, and to remain standing. She could do that. She was certain she could do that, and she was going to find out tomorrow. She sat in the dark and she kept watch, and the night moved slowly around her, and the children breathed, and the fire went low, and she stayed exactly where she was, until the morning came. She gave them the best evening she had. She started in the afternoon, before the light began to go. She made the kind of meal that required more care than an ordinary weekday. She stewed the dried fruit with honey from the small clay pot she had been saving, pressing it into service now because now was the right time for honey, and she could not think of a better reason to use the good thing than a last evening she intended to be as good as she could make it. She made fresh bread, not the preserved kind, but real bread, mixing it in the wide bowl and setting it near the fire to rise, while Roan helped her peel the root vegetables for the soup, a task he performed with the enthusiastic imprecision of someone whose willingness significantly exceeded his skill. "That piece is too small now," she said, "of one root." "It will be fine," Roan said, with the total confidence of someone who had not yet learned to be uncertain about his own methods. "It will be fine," she agreed. Silas stood beside her at the fire and stirred the pot when she handed him the long spoon. He stirred with the careful gravity of someone who had been asked to be responsible for something and was taking it seriously, which was how Silas did most things. "You're teaching us," he said. I'm letting you help, she said. He considered the distinction. Same thing, sometimes, he said. Then, after a moment, is this a special evening? She kept her eyes on the pot. Every evening is special, she said. Some of them you just notice more than others. He said nothing else. He stirred. She made the meal as good as she could make it, with what she had, and she laid it out on the mat near the fire, the way they always ate, when the cold outside made the table feel too far from the warmth. 4 of them in a close arrangement, the twins cross-legged on either side, Lyra propped against the cushion between them, Seraphine across from them all so she could see their faces. She watched them eat, and she kept everything inside her completely still and present, in a way she had not allowed herself to be in weeks. Because tonight, she was done rationing her attention. Tonight she was paying full attention, and letting whatever that cost. Roan ate with his usual focused speed, and then leaned back and said, "Story." "After the dishes," she said. "During." "After," she said, firmly but without heat. He accepted this with the resigned grace of someone who has decided a particular negotiation is not worth pursuing. She washed the dishes slowly, and with more thoroughness than she usually applied to dishwashing, because every ordinary thing she did tonight was a kind of gift, and she wanted the ordinary things to be complete. She dried each one, and put it back in its place. Then she sat down near the fire, and the twins settled on either side of her, Roan leaning his weight against her right arm, with the easy confidence of someone who had long ago decided that leaning on this particular person was allowed, and Silas, sitting close on her left, in the more careful way he had of being near someone, not leaning but present, close enough that she could feel his warmth. Lyra was in her lap, awake, her eyes on the fire, which she had recently decided was worth extended study. "A story," Roan said. "What kind?" she said. "A true one," he said. She looked at the fire for a long time. She thought about what a true story looked like tonight. In this specific evening she was trying to hold as carefully as she could. "All right," she said. "I will tell you about an Omega wolf." Neither twin spoke. Lyra made a small sound and settled against her arm. She was born into a pack, and she grew up knowing that her rank was the lowest, not the strongest, not the fastest, not the one who led anything or decided anything important. She was the one who made the ordinary things work, who kept the food coming and the warmth going, and the children cared for, and the broken things mended, and nobody thanked her for it, because the things she did were so consistent that people stopped noticing them, the way you stop noticing air. "That's sad," Roan said. "It's common," she said. "It's not the same as sad. Common things can become very beautiful when you look at them carefully." He thought about this with the brief, visible seriousness he brought to things he found genuinely interesting. "One day," she continued, "something came for the pack, not for the Omega girl. It wasn't looking for her at all. It was looking for something much more important, something precious and irreplaceable, that the pack had been trusted to protect." She paused. "And the pack was afraid, and the pack moved back, because they had their own lives, and their own people, and the thing that was coming was very large, and they could not find it in themselves to stand against it for something that was not theirs, and that was their decision to make." The fire settled with a small, soft sound. "But the Omega girl stayed," Seraphine said. Silas was very still beside her. She had no weapon worth naming. She had no rank. She had nothing the world would count as power. But she knew the children she was protecting very well, better than anyone else knew them. And she understood something that the people moving back did not understand. She kept her voice even, and her eyes on the fire. She understood that sometimes the only power a person has is the decision about where they are going to stand. And once you know that, once you really know it, the decision becomes very simple. You stand in the right place, and you do not move. Roan's arm was pressed against hers. He had gone completely still, which was rare enough for Roan that she noticed it immediately. "Did something happen to her?" he asked. His voice had a different quality from usual, quieter, coming from somewhere more careful. "Things happened," she said. "Many things. She was not made of stone. Things affected her. But she stayed anyway." "Did the children stay safe?" Silas said. He asked it precisely, in a way that told her he had been building toward this question for some time, and had decided now was the moment for it. She looked at him. His face was very still and watchful. "Yes," she said. "They stayed safe." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he leaned his head against her arm, which was something he very rarely did, being a person who generally kept himself at a slight physical remove except in sleep. She felt the weight of his head against her arm, and she kept completely still, so she would not disturb it. "I think," Roan said, after a long quiet moment, "that the Omega girl is you." She looked at the fire. "She's a story," she said. "Stories are true sometimes," Roan said. He said it the way he said factual things, not as an opinion to be debated, but as a property of the world. Lyra made a sound of pure contentment and grabbed the edge of Seraphine's sleeve and held it with the complete, thoughtless grip that babies had, the kind that was entirely casual and entirely unbreakable. "Time for sleep," Seraphine said. The hour it took to get them to sleep was one of the better hours of her life. Rowan's extended report on things that had occurred to him that day. Silas's measured observations on the same events from a different angle. The mutual negotiation of blanket placement and lamp positioning. The ritual questions, "Will you be here? Will you wake us? Will things be all right?" answered in her steadiest voice. Rowan fell asleep the way he always did, mid-sentence, without warning, as if sleep had simply decided it was done waiting and had claimed him from the inside. One moment he was talking, and the next moment the sentence stopped and his mouth was slightly open and he was gone. Silas took longer. He lay on his side with his face toward the door, and she sat near him and waited, and she could tell from the quality of his breathing that he was awake for a long time. But eventually the breathing changed, deepened, slowed into the rhythm that meant he had finally let go. Then she fed Lyra and did the small circle walk until the baby went limp and heavy and entirely trusted, and she laid her in the cot with the care of someone carrying something they could not afford to drop. She stood in the dark main room and listened to all three of them breathe for a long time. She went to the back room and checked it one final time. The lamp, the oil, the food, the water jars, the blankets on the mats, the cot in its corner, the iron latch bar on the inside of the door. She ran her hand along the stone wall, cold and solid and real. She pressed her palm flat against it and kept it there for a moment. She went back, and she picked up Lyra first, cot and all, carrying it with both arms through the hall to the back room, setting it down in the corner with the specific care of someone doing something they had rehearsed in their mind many times. Lyra did not wake. She went back for Roan. He was heavier than he had been 4 months ago. She felt this in the mechanical way you felt the growth of someone you lifted regularly, as a change in effort rather than in sight. She lifted him, and he turned his face into her shoulder, and made a sound that was not quite a word, and she carried him down the hall, and laid him on the mat beside the cot, and covered him with the warmest blanket, and he settled back into his sleep, without interruption. Silas she carried last, and most carefully, because he was the lighter sleeper. She lifted him with complete steadiness, and he went immediately and entirely limp in the way children went limp when they were deeply asleep and deeply trusting, and she carried him down the hall and laid him beside his brother and covered them both. She stood at the entrance of the back room for a long moment, 3 sleeping children, warm, safe, behind a heavy door with a latch on the inside that even a 5-year-old's hands could operate. She pulled the door closed, very gently. She picked up the short blade Cole had left at the base of the north wall, found before the children woke, exactly where he had said it would be. She carried it to the front of the lodge. She sat down on the floor of the main room in the position she had chosen, with a clear sight line to the front door and the window, with the blade beside her, and the knowledge of the back room behind her, and she breathed slowly and evenly, and she waited. The night outside was quiet, the managed kind of quiet. She heard the forest holding its breath, and she let it hold, and she held hers beside it, and she stayed exactly where she was through the long dark hours, not moving, not leaving, keeping watch over the closed door at the end of the hall, and the sleeping weight of everything she had decided to protect. In the last hour before dawn, she rose. She crossed the room to the front door. She opened it. She stepped across the threshold and stood in the doorway with her shoulders even and her chin level, facing the clearing and the dark tree line beyond it and whatever was coming through it. The cold morning air found the spaces in her clothing. She felt it, and she let it pass through her. Her feet were on the threshold floor. She was standing. She was in the right place. She waited for the morning to arrive. The dawn came in by degrees. the sky above the ridge losing its dark slowly, the clearing emerging from the night the way a room came into view when someone raised a lamp, one thing at a time becoming itself again, shapes gaining edges, edges gaining detail, the world reappearing from the dark the way worlds always reappeared when you had been patient enough to wait for them. She could see the tree line clearly by the time the first man came through it. They came in two lines, moving with the quiet, practiced efficiency of people who had done this particular kind of work many times, and had removed from it everything unnecessary. No talking, no unnecessary movement, just the steady, measured advance of organized men who had somewhere specific to be and knew exactly how to get there. She counted them as they emerged from the tree line. 5, then 12, then 20, then more, until the line stopped and she had her full count. 43 men, armed as Petra's husband had described, crossbows, long blades, the unhurried manner of professionals who believed in their own certainty. The banner carrier came near the front, and she could see the image on it clearly in the gray morning light, an iron veil over an eye. They moved into the clearing in formation, spreading in practiced arcs to either side, taking their positions with the measured spacing of people who had trained together and trusted the training. They stopped about 30 meters from the lodge and held. The Ashwood pack responded before the men were even fully through the tree line. She saw it in her peripheral vision without turning her head, because turning her head was not something she was going to do right now. The movement began on the eastern side of the settlement, a withdrawal, quiet and organized, with the specific quality of something that had been prepared in advance and had a planned route and practiced order. The Ashwood wolves pulled back toward the western tree line steadily, with the thoroughness of people who had made their decision and were at peace with it and were not going to look back. She did not watch them go. She watched the clearing. 3 people remained in the open space besides herself. Cole was one of them. He was on the far side, near the fence post, standing in his usual manner, present without appearing to be anything particular. He looked at her across the distance and she looked back, and neither of them said anything. And then one of the Iron Veil men moved smoothly to intercept him with the easy confidence of someone cutting off a single opponent with 40 behind him. Cole stopped. He looked at Seraphine. She gave a very small shake of her head. He was one person. He could not change the arithmetic. She needed him clear of the clearing. He held her gaze for a moment, longer than she expected. Then he went. The other 2 people remaining were young packmen she knew only by sight, who had apparently not received the withdrawal message in time, or had not been able to make themselves follow it. They stood at the edge of the clearing together for a moment, and then one said something to the other, and they both retreated into the settlement quickly. The clearing was empty now, her and 43 men with crossbows and the gray morning sky above all of them. Very faintly, from the back of the lodge, she heard a small sound, a soft thump, like a 5-year-old rolling over on a mat, then quiet again. The children were beginning to surface toward waking, and the back room was holding, and those were the 2 things she needed to know. She stood in the doorway and looked at the 43 men, and she waited. A man separated from the group and rode forward on a dark horse, covering the distance at a measured, deliberate walk. The walk of someone who was not in a hurry and did not intend to be. He was large, well-built, in his 40s, wearing a long coat over his armor, and moving with the particular ease of a man who was accustomed to being the most capable person in any situation he entered, and had been accustomed to it for long enough that he no longer thought about it consciously. He stopped his horse about 10 meters from the lodge, and he looked at her, the way she had seen people look at things that confused them briefly, before they decided not to be confused by them. "Step aside," he said. "We have no business with Omegas." His voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a man offering a reasonable option to someone who had not thought through their alternatives carefully. "Leave," she said. He looked at her. One moment, the brief, controlled look of someone who has received an unexpected word from an unexpected source. "You're alone here," he said. "The pack has withdrawn. There's nothing to protect." "Leave," she said again. He tilted his head slightly. "Do you know who we are?" "The Iron Veil Syndicate," she said. "You take bloodline contracts." Something moved in his expression. Not alarm, a recalibration. The small but visible adjustment of a person whose model of the situation has received new information and is updating. She had given him something he had not expected, which was a name. It told him she had not been uninformed. "Then you know what we are here for," he said. I know exactly what you are here for, she said. And I know you are not getting it. He sat back slightly in the saddle. He was still not at the part of this where he felt any real concern. She could read that in his body. He was at the stage where he still believed it was going to resolve cleanly. One conversation, one retreat by the person in the doorway, one completed contract. He had done this many times. Every time, eventually, the person in the way moved. You will move, he said. This is only a question of how. My name is Seraphine Vale, she said. She said it the way she had always said it, clearly, without apology, because her name was the one thing she owned completely. I am an Omega of the Ashwood Pack, and I have no formal rank, and nothing the world would call a weapon. You are 43 men with crossbows. I know all of that. She kept her voice even. Her hands were open at her sides. Leave. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he turned his horse and rode back to his men. She watched him go. She let herself breathe once, slowly, from the bottom. He spoke to the man immediately beside him. She was too far to hear the words. The man raised his crossbow. He held the position for a moment, clearly waiting for her posture to shift, for her shoulders to turn, for her feet to move back from the threshold. The warning shot needed something to warn. She did not give him anything to warn. The arrow came fast, and at a slight angle, and hit the doorframe 6 inches from her right ear, with a sharp, clean sound, the hard bite of metal into wood, the brief vibration, then stillness. She stayed where she was. Her right ear was ringing. Her heartbeat had surged upward and was now moving faster than she wanted it to. Her hand tightened once, involuntarily, on the handle of the short blade at her side, and she made a deliberate choice to ease the grip, not because she was going to put the blade down, because gripping it hard was spending energy she could not afford to spend on things that were not her feet. Her feet were on the floor. She was standing. That was what mattered. The commander. She heard one of his men address him as Holt, and she filed the name, looked at her from across the clearing. She could not see his expression in full detail at this distance, but she could read his posture, which had shifted. Not alarm, reassessment, the angle of a man who has encountered data that does not fit his existing model, and is in the process of updating. He said something to the man beside him, an order. The second arrow came lower, aimed to graze rather than to warn, and it came closer than the first. She was very still. She was aware, in a detached and entirely clear way, of everything happening in her body, the elevated heartbeat, the tightness across her chest, the specific sensation of her feet on the threshold, which she was pressing down deliberately, pressing them into the floor with intention, reminding herself physically of the fact that she was standing, that the floor was real, that she was here, and had not moved. She focused on that. Only that. Stop the crossbows, Holt called, from across the clearing. The men lowered their weapons. She heard the collective movement of it, the rustle and adjustment of 43 men, changing their positions. Holt rode forward again, closer this time, close enough to see her face clearly, and for her to see his, which was the face of a man who had encountered something that did not respond the way it was supposed to, and was choosing a different approach. I don't enjoy this, he said. What you're forcing here. I want you to know that. She looked at him. Those children are a political matter, he said. This isn't personal to them. It isn't personal to you. It's a contract. You understand what that means. Someone made an agreement, and there is a conclusion that has to be reached. You step aside. The children go with us. You walk away from here alive. That is a good outcome for you, and it is the outcome I am offering you right now. She let him finish. She let the silence after it settle completely. No, she said. He looked at her. Something was building in his expression now that had not been there before. Something at the edges of it, not quite frustration, and not quite respect, but somewhere in the general territory of both. You understand, he said, that I will complete this contract. I understand that is what you believe, she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he turned his horse and raised his hand. The third arrow came with a different intent from the first two, and she felt it, and she made a very small sound that she had not planned to make. The sound pushed out of her by the impact. She pressed her feet harder into the floor, and held her chin level, and kept her shoulders even, and she did not move. The pain was real, and specific, and she let it be real, and specific, and she let it pass through her, without being the reason her feet moved. She was standing. The floor was beneath her feet. The doorway was around her. She had not moved. She was aware, in the specific and practical way she was aware of all things right now, that the morning was only beginning, that Holt was a professional who had contingencies, that what had just happened was the first approach failing and the second one coming, and then the third after that, and she was going to have to stand in this doorway through all of them. She breathed. She pressed her feet into the floor. She waited for what came next. Behind her, from the back of the lodge, there was a sound so faint it was almost not there. A breath, a shift of weight against the back room door. Someone pressed close to it on the inside, listening. She knew who. She knew without needing to see. She kept her eyes on the clearing and she breathed, and she stayed. The fourth arrow came differently, not from the same angle as the others, from slightly to the left, lower, aimed to hit and hurt rather than to demonstrate intent. It found the upper part of her left arm with a sharp, specific pain that she recognized as the kind that told you something in the body had been genuinely and substantially compromised, rather than simply startled. She absorbed it. She adjusted her balance a fraction to the right, to account for the pull on her left side, and she stayed exactly where she was. Her feet did not move, her chin stayed level, the doorway was still around her. She heard a sound from the Iron Veil formation that she had not heard before. Not an order, not a crossbow mechanism or the movement of horses in tactical position. It was the sound of men shifting in their saddles without instruction, restless, individual movement, the kind that happened when a group of people was watching something that was not going according to any framework they had for it, and their bodies were responding to the wrongness of it before their minds had caught up. 3 of the men in her direct sight line had lowered their crossbows, not on order, on their own. They were still looking at her, but the weapons were down at their sides, and nobody was telling them to raise them again. Holt had not given a new order. There was a pause, a real one, not a tactical pause between commands, but the pause of a commander who had stopped to look at the situation and was having a genuine conversation with what he was seeing. From the back of the lodge, very faint through the walls, she heard a sound that she had been waiting to hear and hoping not to hear at the same time. Lyra, beginning to wake. The small, building sound she made in the first seconds of consciousness when she came back to herself and found herself without the warmth she was accustomed to. The escalating note of a baby who had woken without the presence she needed and was preparing to express her opinion about this in the clearest possible terms. And then, almost immediately, another sound. A voice, low and deliberate and repetitive, too far away and too muffled by walls and distance for words to carry. But she knew the rhythm of it as clearly as she knew her own heartbeat. Roan's voice. She had heard him use this register before, on the evenings when Lyra cried through dinner, and he had appointed himself as auxiliary calming presence, talking to her in a low, patient stream of words, not necessarily words that made sense as a sequence, but words said with a steadiness that communicated steadiness, regardless of meaning. He was doing it now. In the back room, behind the heavy door with the latch on the inside, he was awake, and he was keeping Lyra calm in the dark, while the arrows flew at the person standing between them in the clearing. She fixed her eyes on the middle distance, on the place where the clearing became sky, and she breathed, and she did not think about Roan's voice. She filed it away in the part of her that was not the part keeping her on the threshold, because if she let herself think about it fully right now, it would do something to her that she could not afford. Her feet were on the floor. She was standing. She was still in the doorway. She focused only on that. Holt rode forward again. He came closer this time than he had come before, close enough that his horse was only a few meters from the lodge step, close enough that she could see the lines in his face clearly and read the quality of his attention, which had changed again. He was looking at her the way a person looked at something they had been wrong about and were in the process of understanding how wrong. "How many wounds are you carrying right now?" he said. She considered the question honestly. 4, she said. He was quiet. "You're an Omega," he said. It came out like a statement he was trying to make fit with the thing he was observing, and finding that the fitting was not working. "Yes," she said. "Your recovery rate is what it is," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You will bleed out standing in that doorway," he said. It was not a threat. She heard the difference clearly. It was the genuine assessment of a practical man looking at something that required honesty. Possibly, she said. He sat still on the horse. The morning had fully arrived now, the sun above the eastern ridge, and the clearing bright, in a way that made everything visible. She could see each of his men clearly from the doorway. She could see the ones who had not raised their crossbows again after lowering them. She could see the man at the far right of the formation who had turned his horse slightly sideways, not retreating, but creating the possibility of retreat in the angle of the animal, which was what the body did when the mind had not yet given it permission to do what it was considering. "Why don't you move?" Holt said. It was a different question from the ones he had asked before, smaller, more private. The question of a man who had genuinely arrived somewhere he had not planned to arrive, and did not have a category for what he was looking at. "I can't," she said. It was the simplest and most complete answer she had. He looked at her. "Can't," he repeated. "I know those children," she said. "I know which side Roan sleeps on. I know how to keep Lyra calm when nothing else works. I know that Silas counts things when he is afraid, because counting makes the world feel organized when it isn't." She paused. "You know something that well, and it stops being a question of what you're able to do. It becomes a question of what you are going to do. And I know what I am going to do." Holt was very still on the horse. He was a man who had done this work for 14 years, and who had built, over those years, a framework for understanding how people behaved under extreme pressure. People moved. That was the foundational premise of his work. Under enough pressure, in the presence of enough force, people moved. Not out of cowardice, not out of weakness, but out of the basic logic of survival, which was a logic he had always considered sound, and which the world had always rewarded him for trusting. He was looking at someone who was operating on different logic entirely, and he had run out of the vocabulary for it. "I have never," he said slowly, "in 14 years of this work, had anyone stand in a doorway." She said nothing. "I want to understand what you are," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I told you," she said. "Seraphine Vale. An Omega." He shook his head very slightly. Not a negation. More the gesture of someone who has been given an answer that fits the question asked, but not the question meant. "Those are ranks and names," he said. "That's not what I'm asking." She let the question hang for a moment. "I'm a person who knows where she needs to be," she said. "And that is all I am right now." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he pulled the horse back and returned to his formation. She heard him speaking to his men, a brief exchange. She watched the formation shift, watched crossbows come back up. The 5th arrow hit her shoulder near the site of the 4th wound, which was specifically bad, and the 6th hit her side at an angle that was close to the worst angle, without quite being it. She registered both impacts the way she had registered all the others, as information, as things happening to her body that she needed to account for in her balance and her breathing, and as things that were not her feet. Her feet were on the floor. She was standing. Nothing had changed about those two facts. The 6th arrow settled into her, and the pain of it was specific and large, and she breathed through it, and she stayed. Behind her, through the walls, she heard Roan's voice again. It was still the same low, steady rhythm, still the patient delivery of words to a baby who needed the sound rather than the meaning. But now she heard something in it that she hadn't heard in the earlier versions, a quality that told her he had been doing this for a long time. Not the fresh steadiness of someone who started calm and stayed calm. The deliberate, maintained steadiness of someone who had become afraid at some point and had made a decision to be steady anyway, and was performing it with the full effort of a 5-year-old who had appointed himself responsible for something larger than himself and was not going to let the responsibility down. She pressed her feet into the floor. She thought about the story she had told them last night, the Omega girl who understood that the only power some people had was the decision about where they were going to stand. She thought about how she had described it as a story, and how Roan had said stories were true sometimes, with the certainty of someone stating a property of the universe. The 7th arrow came. Faster than the others, a different angle, looking for the gap that the others had not found, looking for the conclusion that the series of impacts had been building toward. She felt it arrive. She felt the way her body received it, the impact, and the outward radiation of it, the way pain of that magnitude moved not just through the point of contact, but outward and upward, into her arms and her chest, and the quality of her vision, which went briefly bright at the edges and then came back to focus. Her left knee was trying to bend. She was aware of this as a mechanical fact, something her body was doing without her authorization. She addressed it. She noticed the knee. She made a decision. The knee stayed where it was. She was standing. The clearing had gone very quiet. She was aware of this. The quality of the silence that had settled over 43 men. A silence that was different from the pauses before. This was the silence of people who had been watching something long enough that they had stopped being sure what they were watching. It was the silence of people whose framework had been steadily failing them for the past hour, and who had not yet found a new one to replace it with. From the back of the lodge, so faint she almost could not hear it, came Roan's voice. Still going. Still steady. Still doing the one thing he could do from where he was, which was to hold Lyra calm in the dark while the arrows flew. She let the sound of his voice be the thing she stood toward. She aimed at it. She let it be her direction. The formation across the clearing had a different quality now. Men who had not raised their crossbows again after lowering them. Men whose horses were angled for retreat, without their riders having consciously made that choice. A young man at the far right, who was no longer looking at the lodge. He was looking at the ground in front of his horse, with the expression of someone who has been asked to participate in something and has arrived at a private conclusion about it. Holt was at the front of his formation. He was looking at the lodge. He was looking at the doorway. He was looking at her. She looked back at him. She was standing in the doorway, and the morning was fully here, and the clearing was bright, and the arrows had fallen like rain, and she was still standing in the middle of them, and she had not moved, and her feet were on the floor, and whatever came next, that was still true. She breathed. She waited. Cole's man had been fast. That was what Kalen Drath would understand later, when he had time to reconstruct the sequence of events and understand how each piece had reached the next. The courier had covered the distance to the eastern camp in slightly over 2 days, which required a pace that the eastern roads should not have allowed, and which the courier had achieved through a combination of route knowledge and an absolute refusal to stop moving, for more than the time it took to rest the horse. The message had been short. Cole had written it in a hand that was steady and careful, the hand of a man who had thought about every word before committing it. The children are at the Ashwood Lodge in the northern settlement clearing. The Iron Veil Syndicate is approaching from the east with a contract. The pack will not hold. There is one person in the lodge who intends to stay. Come as fast as you can come. No name at the bottom. Kalen had not needed a name. He had read the message twice, folded it, spent 2 minutes with the campaign maps, and called Adrian. "We move now," he said. Adrian was a man who had been Kalen's second for 9 years, and who had developed, over those years, a reliable ability to translate the king's decisions into operational reality, with the minimum amount of unnecessary conversation. He looked at the maps, looked at Kalen, and said, "The eastern line isn't secured." "Leave what's needed to hold it," Kalen said. "Everyone else moves with me." Adrian had looked at him for exactly 1 second, which was long for Adrian, and represented something close to visible concern. Then he had gone to give the orders. They had marched for 2 days and a few hours. This was 2 days fewer than the distance should have taken, and they accomplished it through the same refusal to stop that Cole's courier had used, except that they were not one man on a fast horse but 40 warriors in a group, some of them still carrying injuries from the campaign they had just suspended. The fact that they covered the distance at all was something Kalen would think about later, with a specific and private feeling that he was still trying to name. He had not slept during the march. He had told himself he was staying awake for operational reasons. The route, the pace, the decisions that came up constantly when you were moving a force this quickly, and this was true enough that he had accepted it for the first day. By the second day, he had stopped explaining it to himself. He kept thinking about the message, "One person in the lodge who intends to stay." He turned this sentence over and over during the march, the way he turned tactical problems over, looking for the angles of it, trying to understand what it described. He had no picture of the person, no name, only the sentence. And the sentence had a quality to it that he could not put down. He came over the northern ridge with his 40 men, and he cleared the tree line and he stopped. Not a full stop, not a halt in the military sense. Half a second. His feet kept moving, but his understanding of the scene ahead of him arrived before his interpretation caught up. The clearing was full. Iron Veil men in formation, the banner visible. He had been briefed on the syndicate 2 years ago and he recognized the image. He counted quickly. 40. 43. In a formation that had clearly shifted from its original positions. The spacing was wrong. The horses were at odd angles. The reorganization of people who had been doing something for long enough that it had not gone as expected. The lodge was in the clearing, and in the doorway of it was a figure. Small, still, upright, standing in the doorway with her hands at her sides and her shoulders level, and even from this distance Kaelin could see that she had been standing there for some time, and that the time had cost her significantly. He could also see that she was still standing. His 40 men were already moving into the clearing on the flanking lines Adrian had briefed them on before the march. The Iron Veil Company heard them. 40 wolves moving in formation was not a subtle sound, and the formation turned, and the response was not what Holt would have chosen for his men if he had been given the time to choose. A company that had been watching an Omega girl stand in a doorway and take 7 arrows without falling for the better part of a morning was not, it turned out, in the most coherent state for a sudden reversal of its tactical situation. The panic in the Iron Veil's response was not total, but it was present, and it spread through the company the way panic always spread, from the men who felt it first to the men who felt it second, until the formation that had arrived in the clearing with professional certainty had become something considerably less certain. Holt tried to rally them. Kaelin watched him from across the clearing and recognized the gestures of a professional trying to prevent a rout, the controlled voice, the clear commands, the attempt to re-establish the discipline the situation had been steadily eroding for an hour. He almost respected it. He had no intention of giving him the time to succeed. The battle was fast. His wolves were fresh from a campaign and had arrived angry in the particular way that made them efficient rather than reckless, and the Iron Veil men who had been watching an impossible thing happen for an hour were not prepared to meet fresh wolves with nothing to soften the edge of their resolve. Within 20 minutes the clearing had resolved. Those Iron Veil men who could run were running. Those who could not were on the ground, or in the hands of Kaelin's men at the western edge. Holt himself was taken at the center of the clearing, where he had ridden in the final minutes attempting to organize a stand that his men were no longer capable of giving him. Kaelin did not manage any of this personally. He left it to Adrian, and to the warriors he trusted to do exactly what they were trained to do, and he covered the distance of the clearing on foot, in long strides, because he had seen something when the last of the Iron Veil men turned to run. The woman in the doorway had stayed standing, while there was still something to stand against. The moment the Iron Veil broke and the threat dispersed from the clearing, her legs went. It was not a dramatic fall. It was the specific way a body went down when the thing that had been holding it upright was withdrawn, and the body, which had been operating on a form of credit it could not actually afford, found that the account was suddenly closed. Her knees went first, and she went forward, and he was running the last 15 meters and caught her before she reached the ground. She was lighter than she should have been. That was the first thing he registered. Lighter, and the weight wrong in the way that told him her body had been doing very hard work for a very long time, and had depleted resources that normally did not deplete. The second thing was the arrow shafts. He felt them when he caught her, and he stopped counting at 5, because counting was harder than stopping. She was conscious, her eyes were open, and they focused on him immediately, which meant her mind was still fully present, even if her body had given its notice. She looked at him with the direct, organized attention of someone who had not yet finished working. "The back room," she said. Her voice was thin, but it was there, and it was giving directions. "The children. Back room at the end of the hall. Heavy door. The latches on the inside. A brief stop for breath. Go." He was kneeling on the threshold with his arm around her, and she was directing him. "I have people already moving," he said. He kept his voice level, in the way he kept his voice level when it mattered that the person he was speaking to not feel the need to panic. "Heavy door. Latch on the inside. They know." He heard Adrian at the side of the lodge, the sound of a door, and then he heard it. Roan's voice, higher and closer than the muffled version from outside, talking in the particular way he had been talking all morning, the same low, patient rhythm that had reached the doorway as a thread of sound through walls and distance. Now it was clear and present and real, and now it had changed. The words still coming, but with a different quality. The quality of someone who has heard something outside that sounds like a conclusion rather than a continuation. She heard it too. He felt the change in her. Not a physical relaxation, not yet, but something in the quality of her attention that shifted the same way a held breath shifted when it was finally released. "They're bringing them out now," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. 7 arrow shafts that he could account for from this position, at least 4 in locations that should have made remaining upright impossible, and she had remained upright anyway. He had been in enough battles to have a working understanding of what bodies could sustain and what they could not. What he was looking at was something that expanded that understanding considerably. "Who are you?" he said. She looked up at him. Her eyes were very clear, which surprised him. He had expected someone at the edge of consciousness. She was tired and hurt and depleted, but she was fully present, her gaze direct and organized. "Seraphine Vale," she said. "Omega of the Ashwood Pack." He was quiet for a moment. "How long were you in that doorway?" he said. "Since before dawn," she said. He looked at the sun position above the eastern tree line, well past mid-morning, 4 hours at minimum. 4 hours on that threshold, with 7 arrow shafts in her body, and 43 armed men in the clearing, and the pack gone. He heard, from inside the lodge, the sound of the backroom door being opened by Adrian. He heard Roan's voice shift into a different register, not the calming voice, not the patient voice, but the ordinary voice, the everyday voice, the voice of a boy coming back to the world from a long, deliberate effort at keeping it together. And then he heard the sound he had not heard in 4 months. Lyra. Not crying, not the distress sound, not the hunger sound, not any of the sounds he had been afraid he might not get to hear again. The small, satisfied, utterly present sound she made when she was in arms, she recognized as completely safe. Something happened in his chest that he did not immediately know how to account for. "I need to move you inside," he said. She nodded. Just that. A nod, which was everything she had left to give. He lifted her. He did it carefully, more carefully than he had done anything in recent memory, with the specific attention of someone who understood that what they were holding had already been through enough and did not need to be handled carelessly on top of everything else. He carried her across the threshold into the lodge. As he stepped over the doorway, he looked down, briefly. He saw her footprints in the threshold dust, deep, deliberate, pressed into the floor with intention, the prints of someone who had decided where they were going to stand and had stood there. He carried her inside and called for Ren and held her hand while he waited, and he did not let go. The pack healer returned before noon. Her name was Ren. She was small, precise, in her 50s, and she moved through her work with the absolute economy of someone who had spent decades doing difficult things, in conditions that did not always cooperate. She had not been among the pack members who withdrew to the western tree line. Kalen had noted this when he arrived and had not yet asked about it. It was filed for later, along with a number of other things about the Ashwood Pack that were filed for later. She came into the lodge with her bag of tools, assessed the situation on the mat in about 6 seconds, and began working without ceremony. Kalen stood near the far wall and watched her. The arrow shafts had to come out. Ren did this in order of urgency, rather than the order they had been received, and she worked with a focused efficiency that made the process as brief as it could be made, without being less careful than it needed to be. She talked while she worked, not to Kalen, not to anyone specific, just the low, steady self-commentary that some healers used to maintain their own concentration through difficult work. Seraphine lay on the wide mat near the fire where Kalen had placed her. She kept her eyes open through most of it and her breathing controlled, and she made very little sound. He noticed the very little sound. He had seen experienced men take less than what she was taking and make considerably more noise about it. He had not, in those cases, considered them weak for it. Pain was pain, and it did not come with a required standard of performance. But the quiet on the mat was notable. The twins were brought in while Ren was still working. Adrian brought them in through the side entrance. Roan came first, walking with the particular directed energy of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has been wanting to get there for some time. He saw Seraphine on the mat. He saw Ren working. He stopped for exactly 1 second, long enough to take in the full picture and process it, and then he crossed the room and sat down beside the mat, on the side that was not obstructing Ren, in the position of someone who has decided not to be in the way, but is absolutely not going anywhere. Silas came in behind him and took up the same position on the other side without any discussion about it. Kalen stood near the wall. Neither of his sons had looked at him since entering the room. He observed this. He was a man who had built a career and a kingdom on looking at what was actually happening, rather than what he expected to be happening. And what was actually happening was that his 2 5-year-old sons had walked into a room containing their father, whom they had not seen in 4 months, and had walked straight past him to the mat. He did not experience this as rejection. He experienced it as information. The information was very clear. Lyra was carried in by B, one of his youngest warriors, who held the infant with the confident practicality of someone who had younger siblings at home and knew what to do. Lyra was awake and assessing, making the sounds she made when she was taking in a new situation, not distressed, not settled, somewhere in between. B moved toward the mat. Ren shifted without looking up, making space. BA positioned Lyra against Seraphine's uninjured side, against her arm. Lyra made a soft sound. She turned her face toward Seraphine's shoulder. She went quiet. Ren said, "Still working. Better." Kalen looked at the mat. His 3 children arranged around a woman he had never met before this morning, distributed in the geography of people who had been living in close proximity long enough that they knew each other's weight and warmth without needing to think about it. Roan with his jaw set and his eyes on Ren's hands, tracking the work with the same focused attention he brought to everything. Silas with his back straight and his face slightly turned, monitoring the room from this position in his characteristic way. Lyra, with her face pressed into the gray sleeve, her fist curled, her breathing deep. "How serious?" he said to Ren, quietly. She considered her answer while her hands continued their work. "She should not be present to answer that question," she said. "She is, which tells you what you need to know about the morning. The wounds are serious. None of them, as they stand now, will end her. She will heal slowly, and needs to be still and watched carefully for the next several days. What does she need right now?" Ren glanced at the mat, at the 3 children pressed close to the woman they had appointed as the center of their world. "Warmth and quiet," she said. "Those 3 will see to both better than I can." He looked at his children. He had not seen them in 4 months. He was looking at them now and doing the rapid, quiet inventory that parents did when they had been separated from their children. Same, different, well, changed. What matters and what doesn't. And what he was finding was that they were the same in the essential things and different in the ways that 4 months of experience always changed people. Roan looked older, not physically. The body did not age visibly in 4 months, but in the quality of his stillness. Roan had never been the still twin. Roan moved toward things, talked at things, filled rooms with his presence and his enthusiastic, forceful opinions. The stillness on him now was something different. The stillness of someone who had needed to be still at a specific moment and had done it when it mattered, and the capacity had stayed afterward the way capacities stayed when they had been used for real. Silas looked like Silas, which meant he looked like a person containing considerably more than he was showing, a presence that was deeper than its surface and quieter than its depth. He was leaning very slightly toward Seraphine's side of the mat. The lean was small. He probably did not know he was doing it. It told Kalen more than a long conversation would have. Ren finished and packed her tools and gave Kalen her instructions, which he listened to completely and committed to memory, because when he received instructions about something important, he received them fully. She went out to attend to 3 of his warriors, who had taken injuries in the clearing. The lodge was quieter now. Adrian was outside managing the clearing and the aftermath, and the question of Holt. Inside, there were 5 of them. Kalen near the wall, the twins at the mat, Lyra against the arm, Seraphine lying still with her eyes closed. Roan looked up at his father. "She never moved," he said. The words were not an explanation, and not a complaint, and not a report, in any formal sense. They were a fact, delivered in the specific register of a child, presenting something important, and trusting the adult to understand its weight. There was a gravity to it that Kalen had not previously encountered in quite this form from a 5-year-old. "Tell me," Kalen said. He sat down on the floor, because Roan was at mat level, and standing above him did not feel like the right position for what was about to be said. Roan told him. He told it precisely and in sequence, without the embellishments children sometimes added to stories they told adults, and without the hesitations of children who were not sure they were believed. He had been in the back room. He had heard the sounds from outside and identified them by type. The mechanisms of crossbows, the horses, the specific sound of many men in organized position. He had pressed his ear to the backroom door, because listening was better than not knowing. He had kept Silas calm, he said. Lyra had woken, and he had talked to her until she was not frightened anymore. She never made a sound, he said, about Seraphine. The arrows hit, and she never made a sound. I know, because I was listening. I kept waiting for her to move. I kept thinking she would have to. He paused. She didn't. Kalen was sitting on the floor of the lodge, listening to his 5-year-old son describe in precise detail the actions of a woman he had met this morning. He was a king who had commanded armies and made decisions that shaped the borders of territories. He was sitting on the floor. 7, Silas said. He had been silent the entire time Roan was speaking, and when his voice came, it had the quality of something that had been ready for some time and had been waiting for the right moment. Not a performance of patience, the real thing, the product of someone who had developed genuine patience because the world had required it of him. 7 arrows, Silas said. I counted the sounds. He looked at the mat. She was still in the doorway when your men came. Kalen looked at the mat. He looked at the gray dress, the plain, simple, ordinary cloth of it. He looked at what Wren's work had done to cover the 7 wounds in the body of a woman who had stood on a threshold from before dawn until well past mid-morning, and had taken every arrow and had not moved. He felt something happen in his chest that he did not have language for immediately. He had felt a great many things in his life for which he had eventually found language, and he had learned over time that the things that resisted language the longest were usually the ones that mattered most. She told us a story, Silas said, the night before last, about an Omega wolf who was the backbone of a kingdom. Kalen looked at his younger son. She told it like it was about someone else, Silas said, but I don't think it was. Kalen looked back at the mat. Seraphine's eyes were closed now. She had gone to sleep in the sudden, complete way of someone whose body had collected what it was owed the moment the permission arrived. Lyra was asleep against her arm, her face turned into the gray cloth. Roan was still beside the mat, chin on his knees, watching her sleep with the focused attention of someone who intended to continue watching for as long as watching was required. Silas looked at his father for a moment. Then he leaned back against the wall in his usual position, facing the door, and closed his eyes. Kalen found a chair from the corner of the room, placed it beside the mat, and sat in it. Adrian came in once and said the necessary things about the clearing, and Holt, and the positioning of the men, and Kalen gave the necessary responses without leaving the chair, and Adrian went back out without comment. 9 years working closely with someone taught you which rooms required their presence, and which ones did not. He stayed in the chair through the afternoon. He managed what needed managing from where he was. He sent people out and received people back and handled the decisions that required handling, and he did not leave the room. The afternoon light moved across the lodge floor in the way afternoon light moved when you had nothing to do but watch it. Steadily, without asking permission, changing the angles of things as it went. He watched it, and he thought about the message that had brought him here. One person who intends to stay. He thought about arriving over the ridge and seeing the clearing and seeing the doorway. He thought about catching her when her legs gave way, about the weight of her, wrong, body running on credit, and the arrow shafts he had felt in the moment he caught her. He thought about her saying the children's location the moment she was conscious enough to speak, giving him directions in a voice that had been giving directions all morning and had not finished. He thought about Roan's voice in the back room, a 5-year-old keeping Lyra calm in the dark because he had decided it was his job and he was going to do his job. He thought about Silas saying 7, said like a number that had been counted carefully and was being reported accurately, because accuracy was what the situation required. He looked at the woman on the mat, and he looked at his 3 children arranged around her in the specific geography of people who belonged together, and he sat in the chair, and he let the evening come in slowly around all of them. She woke the following afternoon. The light in the lodge was the angled gold of mid-afternoon, coming through the shutter gaps at the angle that said the sun had cleared its midpoint and was heading toward the western ridge. The fire was low but going, which meant someone had tended it through the night and morning. The room smelled of Wren's herb tea, which meant she had been given some at some point in the night without being fully aware of it. She moved her eyes before she moved her head, taking account of the room in the careful way she always took account of spaces she woke in. Lyra was in the cot. Asleep, her fist at her chin, her chest rising and falling in the deep, easy rhythm that meant she was content. Roan was on the mat beside her, his mat, arranged so that his hand was near her arm without quite touching, the passive proximity of someone who had decided to be close without being intrusive. Silas was against the wall to her right, facing the door. In the chair beside the mat was the Alpha King. He was awake. He was looking at her. He was wearing the same clothes he had arrived in, the same travel-worn coat, the same armor that had seen a campaign before it saw this morning, which meant he had not left this room or this chair in over a day. She looked at him. He had a face that became clearer the longer you looked at it, the details emerging in sequence, the intelligence in the eyes, the particular quality of a person who had been through a great many things and had not been made brittle by any of them. He was looking at her with the careful attention of someone who had been waiting to be looked at back, and was not going to make a performance of the waiting having been long. She tried to sit up. His hand came forward and stopped her. Not a forceful stop, one hand placed lightly on her shoulder, making the point rather than enforcing it. She let herself be stopped. She looked at the ceiling. "How long?" she said. "This is the afternoon of the day after," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected and quieter, the voice of a man managing his volume in a room where people were sleeping. She worked through the arithmetic, roughly 30 hours horizontal, longer than she had intended, but she had not been entirely the one making decisions about that. "The children," she said. "All here," he said. "All well. Roan has barely left your side. Silas barely left Roan's. Lyra has been fed and changed, and has no apparent strong opinion about the events of yesterday." She almost smiled. The movement pulled something in her side, and she let the smile stop. "Ren says you stay still for several days," he said. "I need to." "Several days," he said again, with a clarity that was not a command, but was very sure of where it was going. She was quiet. She looked at the ceiling, which she knew very well from months of looking at it at night, when the children were asleep, and the lodge was settled, and she let herself exist, in the space between one day and the next. "You caught me," she said. "You were falling," he said. "I was aware of that," she said. A moment of quiet between them. The fire shifted. "You held until we arrived," he said. "I don't know if you knew we were coming." She thought about how to answer this accurately. "I knew a message had been sent," she said. "I didn't know if it would arrive in time to matter." "And you stood there anyway." "Yes." He was quiet. Lyra shifted in the cot and resettled, making a small sound that resolved into silence. He glanced at the cot with the automatic reflex of someone who had been checking it at regular intervals for the past day and had made it into a habit. "Why?" he said. One word. She had been expecting it. She looked at the ceiling, and she thought about it honestly, the way she thought about things she considered important, without performance, without the version that sounded better than the truth. "The children were scared," she said, "and no one else stayed." He was still. "That's why," he said. "That's the beginning of it," she said. "The rest is harder to put into words." "Try," he said. She thought about how to be accurate. "I've been an Omega my whole life," she said. "I know what that means. I know what position I hold on any rank chart in any pack in these territories. I know what I have, and what I don't have, and what I am considered capable of contributing." She paused, organizing the next part carefully. "I also know those 3 children. I know which side Roan sleeps on, and how to keep Lyra calm when nothing else works, and that Silas counts things when he is afraid, because counting makes the world feel organized when it isn't." She stopped. "You know something that well, and it stops being a question of what you are able to offer. It becomes a question of what you are going to do, and I knew what I was going to do." Kaelin was very still in the chair beside her. She had the impression, from the specific quality of his attention, that he was one of those people who listened the way she listened, fully, without planning the response while the other person was still speaking, taking in what was actually being said, rather than what was expected. "You're an Omega," he said. He said it not as a diminishment, but as a fact. He was placing next to other facts, trying to understand how they arranged themselves next to each other. "Yes," she said. "You had no obligation." "No official one," she said. "You stood in that doorway for 4 hours." "Yes." With 7 arrows in you. I'm aware of the number, she said. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was deliberate, choosing words carefully. I need you to understand something, he said. I have been leading armies for 16 years. I have been a king for 14. I have seen courage in a great many forms. Trained courage, instinctive courage, the kind that comes when a person has nothing left to lose. He paused. In 16 years, I have never seen anyone stand in a doorway and take 7 arrows and not move. She looked at him. She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, which was her usual response to things she did not know how to answer. My children are alive, he said. My bloodline continues. My daughter was sleeping against your arm when I carried you inside, and she slept there through the night, because she would not sleep anywhere else. He stopped. He looked at the mat where his children were sleeping, and when he looked back at her, his expression had something in it that she had no category for, because she had never had a king look at an Omega with that particular quality of look. He stood up from the chair. He stood in the space beside the mat, and then he did something she had not anticipated. He bowed his head. Not a small gesture, not the tilt of acknowledgement or the nod of courtesy. A real bow, deliberate, complete. The specific bow of someone who did not make that gesture easily and was making it fully. There was nothing in it that suggested habit. It cost something, and he gave it without any reservation. She looked at him. She did not say anything, because there was nothing immediately available that was adequate to the moment, and she had always preferred honest silence to words that were not adequate. He sat back down. I want to give you something, he said. His voice was steady and direct. Whatever you want. Rank, land, gold, title, freedom to go anywhere you choose. Anything within my power to give is yours. Name it. She looked at him. He waited. She thought about what she wanted. She ran through the options he had named, because she was honest enough to take the question seriously rather than deflecting it out of politeness. Land had never been something she had wanted in any specific way. Rank was something she had made peace with not having a long time ago, and peace was different from wanting. Title felt like a costume that did not fit the person wearing it. Gold was useful, but was not the point. She thought about the past 4 months. She thought about the shape of those months, the breakfasts on the mat, the stone collection debates, the small circle walk, the wordless song she had invented. Silas's face turned toward the door, Roan's hand in hers on the first day. The weight and warmth of that hand, the specific grip of a 5-year-old who had decided to trust you completely. She looked at the cot where Lyra was sleeping, her fist tucked under her chin. She looked at Roan near her arm. She looked at Silas against the wall, facing the door even in his sleep. I just want to stay near them, she said, if that's allowed. Kaelin was still. Near them, he repeated, not an echo, the repetition of a person making certain they have understood correctly. I'm not asking for a formal position, or a title, or anything that changes what I am, she said. I just want to be in the same place they are. That is what I want. He looked at her for a long time. She held the look without flinching, because she had said a true thing, and true things did not require flinching. That, he said at last, is more than allowed. She nodded. She looked back at the ceiling. She heard him settle back in the chair. She heard the fire, and the particular breathing of the twins, Roan's deeper, Silas's slower, and the small sounds of Lyra in her cot. She heard the lodge settle around her in the way it settled at this hour, the familiar sounds of a building she had been living in for 4 months, and knew as well as she had ever known any place in her life. I want you to know something, he said, after a while. She waited. The person who sent the message did not sign it. I don't know who wrote it. He paused. But the message said there was one person in the lodge who intended to stay. That was all it said about you. 1 sentence, a brief quiet. I marched my men 2 days, in the time it should have taken 4, because of that 1 sentence. I kept it in my head, the whole way. She listened. One person who intends to stay, he said. I kept thinking about what kind of person that was. I kept trying to picture them. I had no picture and no name. I had only the sentence. He stopped. And then I came over the ridge and I saw the clearing, and I saw you in the doorway, and I understood. She looked at the ceiling. What did you understand? She said. He was quiet for a moment. That some people are more certain than others, he said. about where they're going to stand, and that certainty is something different from strength, and something different from courage in the ordinary sense. It's something a person either has or they don't. She thought about the story she had told the twins, the Omega girl who understood that staying was the rarest thing. I have it about a limited number of things, she said. This was one of them, he said. Yes, she said. He was quiet after that. She was quiet. The fire was small and steady. Outside the lodge, the settlement sounds were beginning to return, the ordinary background of a place resuming after something has happened in it. She closed her eyes. She was not asleep, she was resting them, because the ceiling was very familiar, and she did not need to look at it. Seraphine, he said. Yes, she said, without opening her eyes. Thank you. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the morning, and the doorway, and the sound of Roan's voice in the back room keeping Lyra calm in the dark. She thought about the weight of Silas's head against her arm the night before, the unfamiliar warmth of it. She thought about carrying them one by one down the dark hall to the back room while they slept. All right, she said. Just those 2 words. She heard him sit back in the chair. She heard him settle in the particular way of a man who has decided he is not going anywhere, and is arranging himself accordingly. She kept her eyes closed, and she let herself rest, with the sounds of the lodge around her, and the 3 children breathing, and the fire going, and for the first time in many days, she did not keep any part of her mind at the window or the door. She had nothing left to watch for tonight. The story spread the way true stories spread, not through announcements or official declarations, but through the human mechanism of one person telling another person something they needed to hear, fire to fire, voice to voice, across the distances that separated the northern wolf territories from each other. It began with Cole, who had not intended to be the origin of anything. He told it to his wife the evening after the battle in the flat. Precise way he told everything, without embellishment, because the truth did not require embellishment, and he had always found that adding things to true stories was an insult to the facts. He told her simply what he had witnessed, an Omega girl, a doorway, 7 arrows. She never moved. His wife told Petra the following morning. Petra told the herb store women in 3 separate settlements in the following week, because Petra traveled the supply routes, and the supply routes connected people who would otherwise not be connected. It went from there. By the time the first heavy frost came to the northern territories, 6 weeks after the morning in the clearing, there were wolves 3 territories away who knew the outline of what had happened. An Omega girl, the Alpha King's children, a doorway. The number 7 was consistent across every version. The ending was consistent in the way that true things were consistent, not identical in the details but identical in the shape, the core of it, unchanged no matter how many mouths it passed through. She never moved. Seraphine did not hear most of these tellings. She was in the lodge for the first 3 weeks, which was the recovery period Ren had required, and in the lodge there was very little information coming in from the outside world. What reached her came through the twins, who were excellent informal reporters of settlement activity. The packmen look at you differently now, Roan told her, about 12 days in. He was sitting on the edge of the mat with the authority of someone delivering a professional assessment. Before, they looked at you the way people looked at something that is there. Now they look at you the way people look at something that is important. And what do you think the difference is? She said. You were always important, he said, with complete confidence. They just didn't know it before. He considered this for a moment. Now they know it. Gareth came to the lodge 10 days after the battle. He stood in the doorway, the repaired doorway, the arrow wounds in the frame filled with new wood so the frame was whole again, and he had the expression of a man who had been rehearsing something for some time and had not yet arrived at a version he was fully comfortable with. He told her the pack was glad the children were safe. He said the situation had developed more quickly than anticipated. He said that decisions made under extreme pressure were sometimes not the decisions that would be made with more time. She listened to all of it with the patience she had developed over 6 years. I understand, she told him, which was true. Understanding and forgiving were not the same thing. But she had time, and she was not a person who needed to hold things against people for longer than the things required. Kaelin had been standing in the hall behind Gareth during this visit. He said nothing. But she saw his face, and she filed what she saw in it for later consideration. He had stayed. This was the central fact she was still arranging her understanding around. He had sent messages to his campaign generals, put Adrian in formal command of the Eastern Front, and he had stayed in the Ashwood settlement while she recovered. He managed what needed managing from a distance, with the efficiency of someone who had built a system that could function without his physical presence, and he divided the rest of his time between the children and the quiet question of what came next. He spent a great deal of time with the twins. She watched this with the specific attention of someone who cared about the outcome and was not quite willing to admit how much they were assessing it. Kalen was not a man who had an instinctive knowledge of how to be a father to children he had been absent from for 4 months. He was a man who was trying, which she had come to believe was sometimes better than instinct, because trying involved looking carefully at what was actually in front of you and adjusting when what you were doing was not working, rather than simply doing the thing that felt natural and hoping it was right. With Roan he was direct and engaged, and willing to argue about things, which Roan required more than almost anything else. With Silas he was quiet and unhurried, and comfortable with silence, which Silas found more genuinely welcoming than any amount of words. With Lyra he was careful in the way of someone who understood that something was precious, and was not going to be careless with it. She watched all of this, and felt something she thought about in small pieces, rather than all at once, because all at once it was too large to look at directly. It was not jealousy, because jealousy would have required her to want for herself what the children were getting, and what she wanted was for the children to get it, all of it, everything, more than they had gotten when she was the only one giving it. It was something more like a thing that had been wrong being put back into its correct configuration, something she recognized as right in the way you recognized right things, not by being told, but by the way they sat in the world when they were finally arranged properly. Roan told her one afternoon, with no preamble, that he had informed his father she was better at wrestling than she looked. "You've never seen me wrestle," she said. "I told him anyway," Roan said. It seemed relevant. "Why relevant?" she said. "Because he is going to want to know things about you," Roan said, with the easy confidence of someone stating an obvious fact. "And I know things about you. So." He returned to his bread with the efficiency of someone who has concluded a point and moved on. "Roan," she said. "He likes you," Roan said, without looking up. "He stays in your room. He was there all yesterday afternoon, and all last evening, and I went to check last night, and he was still in the chair." He shrugged slightly. "People don't sit in chairs that long because they have nowhere else to be." "He barely knows me," she said. "He stayed," said Roan, closing the argument with the simplicity of someone for whom this was sufficient and complete proof of anything. She had no good answer to that, so she said nothing, and Roan went back to the stone debate, which had been ongoing for weeks now, and showed every sign of continuing indefinitely. The weeks passed. Then more weeks. The pack's attitude toward Seraphine shifted in the way that real shifts happened. Not suddenly, not by announcement, but gradually, and without fanfare, one interaction at a time, the accumulated weight of many small changes, adding up to something visible from a distance. Petra used her name first, rather than any description. Then the women at the well began to meet her eyes. Then the specific social gap that packs created around their lowest-ranked members, the not quite there quality of how they were included in things, began to close. Not because anyone decided it should, because a story had passed through enough mouths that the person in the story had become too real for the old version of her to hold. Kalen gave her a room. Not a corner, not a shared mat, not a position in a shared space. A room in the lodge, at the end of the hall, that was hers. He arranged it without ceremony, told her one afternoon that the room had been cleared and was hers, asked if she needed anything for it. She had not known what to say for a moment, and in the space of that moment, something between them had shifted slightly, in a way she did not yet have a name for. "I don't need much," she said. "I know," he said. "Tell me what you do need." She told him, and the things appeared, and she did not spend more time thinking about the simplicity of that than it required. Having a room of her own was something she thought about at intervals, privately, in the way she thought about things that were too close to the center of herself to share. She had not had a room of her own since she was 15, and the room at 15 had not quite been hers either. It was her mother's room, and the ownership of it had always depended on things that had not proven permanent. This room had a door she could close, and a small window that faced east, and a lamp she had chosen herself. It was hers. She lay in it at night after the children were settled, and she thought about the girl who had walked 3 days in the cold to reach a pack that would keep her, and the space between that girl and this room was so vast and specific that she spent a long time just acknowledging it. Lyra, at 6 months, discovered furniture. She pulled herself to standing against anything she could reach. The side of the cot, the chair leg, the low edge of the table. With the single-minded determination of someone who had identified a principle and was applying it systematically. She would hold herself upright for a few seconds, and then fall, and then immediately try again, with no apparent frustration, as if falling was simply part of the process, and the process was the point. "She's stubborn," Roan said, watching his sister hold herself upright against the cot, with the focus of someone performing a feat of engineering. "She's determined," Seraphine said. "Same thing," said Silas from the corner, without looking up. Kaylin, who was in the room at the time, looked at Seraphine. She looked at him. Something passed between them that she did not annotate, which was how she had been handling the things that passed between them, acknowledging them, filing them, not yet reading them aloud. There were quite a few of them now. He brought her tea one evening when the children were asleep and she was sitting at the small table with a piece of mending. He set the cup beside her without being asked. He sat down across the table without being invited. She said nothing and he said nothing, and they stayed like that for a while, her mending, him with his own cup, the fire going, the lodge settled and quiet around them. It was the most comfortable silence she had ever been in with another adult. She thought about that for a long time, after he had gone to his room. The autumn moved toward winter. The frost on the clearing thickened each morning. The settlement adjusted to the presence of the Alpha King, the way settlements adjusted to large, permanent presences, with a combination of wariness and accommodation that gradually became simply normal. Kaylin had dispatched word to the Eastern Front that the campaign would resume in the spring, and the border faction had pulled back after the Iron Veil's failure, which had apparently communicated something to them about the quality of the opposition they were facing. One morning Roan told her, over breakfast, that his father had asked him what her favorite food was. "What did you say?" she said. "The bread with honey," Roan said, "the kind you made on the special evening. You only know that because you ate the largest portion of it," she said. "I know it because you made it on the best evening," he said. He was entirely serious. "That's how you know someone's real favorite. You watch what they use the good thing on. The good thing only comes out for the thing that matters most." She looked at him. She thought about the evening she had made the honey bread. She thought about the story she had told, about the Omega girl who understood that staying was the rarest power. She thought about Roan falling asleep mid-sentence, and Silas leaning his head against her arm, the warm, unfamiliar weight of it. She thought about carrying them one by one down the dark hall to the back room. She had used the honey that evening because she had not been certain there would be another evening to use it on. And then another evening had come, and another after that. And now there were months of them, each one its own unrepeatable thing. One evening in late autumn, when the settlement fires had been built against the cold, and the lodge was warm, and the children were asleep, and the world had taken on the specific quality of peace that followed a long and difficult thing, Kaylin sat down beside her on the wide mat near the fire. She could feel that he had something to say. She had learned to read that quality in him, the way his stillness changed slightly when he was approaching something he had been thinking about for a while. She waited. "I want to ask you something," he said, not as a king asking someone in the pack, as a man asking someone whose answer matters to him. She set down the cloth she had been working with. She looked at the fire. "Would you stay?" he said. She waited, because she could tell from the way he said it that the sentence was not yet complete. Not near the children, or, yes, near the children, always near the children, but I mean something else too. He paused. He was not a man who usually had difficulty with words, and the pause said something. "I mean with me. I mean as something I have not yet asked you to consider, but that I would very much like to ask you now." She looked at the fire for a long moment. She thought about the doorway. She thought about her feet on the threshold, pressed into the floor with the specific intention of not moving. She thought about what she had said to Silas the night before the Iron Veil came, that some people were more certain about which direction they were going to move, and that the certainty was a kind of power that nobody could take. She thought about what Roan had said. He stayed, as if staying was the clearest possible proof that something was real. She turned and looked at Kalen. He was looking at her with the full attention he gave to things that were important to him. The complete, patient, genuine attention of a man who was asking rather than assuming, who had asked the question, and would wait as long as it took for the real answer. She thought about all the things she could say. She thought about the true ones. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The words were simple. She had said them before, in a different context, standing in a doorway with her feet on the floor. But they were the same words, and they carried the same truth in them, the same quality of something that did not require elaboration, because it was already complete in itself. He was quiet for a moment. Then he exhaled, slowly, the way a person exhaled when they had been holding a breath longer than they realized, and had finally been given somewhere to set it down. She looked back at the fire. Outside the lodge, the northern settlement went about its evening. The wolves of the Ashwood pack were in their halls and their lodges, doing the ordinary things of an ordinary night. The torches were lit. The cold had the comfortable edge that came before the first real snow. The sky above the ridge was clear. Inside the lodge, the 3 children were sleeping. Roan on his mat, face down, arm across his brother. Silas against the wall, facing the door. Lyra in her cot, her fist uncurled for once, her hand open, her breathing deep and even and sure. Seraphine looked at the fire, and let the warmth of it reach her all the way, and she sat exactly where she was. She had always been very good at staying.